Okay, so I'm going to talk about some work that I began more than 10 years ago in West Africa, but I'm also going to uh, move over to Chicago partway through the presentation and talk about how some of this work helped inspire Chicago's response to gun violence, and then step back towards the end and sort of think about what kinds of circumstances, what kinds of cities can interventions like what I'm talking about today work, because there aren't any magic solutions for every city. There are treatment that fit particular diagnoses. And we're going to go to Liberia, which is a small nation in West Africa. At the time, it had a population of roughly 4 million people. And when I started studying this intervention, the country was really just 5 or 6 years out of a long-running period of civil war and political instability. It was some years before the country again was destabilized by Ebola, but nonetheless, this is a period of economic growth. This is a time of peace. This is a time of growing democracy as Liberia transitioned from, despite being one of the poorest countries on the planet, below the Human Development Index of Afghanistan, for example, nonetheless progressing speedily along almost every metric you would want your country to progress along. And so it's a hopeful period, but nonetheless a desperately poor and somewhat uncertain and unstable period. And at the time, most of the government, most of the attention and the UN peacekeeping mission were focused on rural areas, ex-combatants that were working in diamond mines, occupying gold mines, rubber plantations, the potential for ethnic violence in villages, all were extremely important. And that was really what people like myself were dedicated to studying. But when passing through the capital of Monrovia to study and work on some of these issues and violence reduction in the periphery, the violence really became apparent in the center. There was a group of urban youth. These are, this is just one example, young men known as wheelbarrow boys. Now, what's a wheelbarrow boy? Wheelbarrow boy is helping you shuttle your goods around the market if you're a merchant or a customer, and they're for hire, but they're also notorious pickpocketers. And in the evenings or weekends, they might moonlight as armed robbers or engaged in home invasion. So a lot of sort of petty, generally non-lethal, but quite serious crime. Likewise, there is a tremendous amount of drug selling, armed robbery, street fights, and increasingly violent crime, and concerns that maybe this is the real source of instability, maybe an election riot, or perhaps, as we saw when Cote d'Ivoire, when a civil war ignited briefly in Cote d'Ivoire, I believe in 2010 or 2011, the Cote d'Ivoirian militaries didn't go to the rural areas to recruit the young men in gold and diamond mining camps. That was too difficult. They recruited and threw young men onto trucks and drove them to Cote d'Ivoire from Monrovia. And so the real source of potential political instability as well as crime was coming from the city. And so in response to that, there's an organization called NEPA, the Network for Empowerment and Progressive Initiatives, founded by two Liberians, Johnson Bohr and Morley Guguzawu. They had been combatants early in the Civil War in the early 1990s and had come out of that as young men in the mid-90s, convinced that they needed to help young men like themselves get out of these lives of violence. And for a decade and a half, through trial and error, they tried out this intervention and that intervention. They downloaded texts and manuals. They attended trainings, every youth intervention and every anti-violence intervention you could imagine. And through this process of trial and error, by the time I met them in around 2008, 2009, they had boiled down what they were doing into an 8-week program that they called personal transformation. And personal transformation meant meeting about 3 times a week in a group of about 20. So you're seeing Johnson lead a group here. This is on the 3rd floor of a burned out hulk of a 8-story building in the middle of the notorious red light neighborhood, which is a big, vivacious market, low and middle income residential area, but also one that was home to some of the most criminal and potentially unstable young men. And often this building and this setting, we'd put up these wicker walls in order to sort of combat the vertigo that you would get from potentially being on the third floor of this sort of burned out hulk of a building. And the whole idea was to be very close to where these young men were living and plying their trade, what they called the hustle. And the hustle could mean just selling, petty trade and goods, but the hustle with the sort of glint in your eye means criminal activities. And so these men were engaged in a whole variety of these sort of petty and quite serious crimes. And in some sense, the program almost seemed too good to be true. But the anecdotally seemed to have real results. And I worked with Johnson to sort of write down what they do day by day, step by step. And what became apparent as this sort of trial and error curriculum got laid out was that they had primarily adopted and used insights from cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT. And we decided to study this, but potentially also study what happens when we marry CBT with some form of economic assistance. Now, what's cognitive behavioral therapy? Well, cognitive behavioral therapy is a method for helping people basically work through and overcome some automatic and problematic behaviors. CBT is a method, and it's targeted towards problematic behaviors. So if you have issues with depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, fears, you can go see a psychologist, and chances are most psychologists will use cognitive behavioral techniques to help you target the automatic reactions, thoughts, emotions, and behaviors that are associated with those specific symptoms. In this case, CBT was a method used to target certain other types of behaviors that were associated with what we can think of as antisocial behaviors, these criminal and other violent activities. And the primary one that this program, the Sustainable Transformation of Youth in Liberia, or the STYLE program, as NEPA like to call it, was fostering skills of self-control. This could be as simple as learning to plan, which is just learning how to break down large goals into smaller ones. Examples would be starting with very basic plans. How are you going to feed your family for the next week? Becoming accustomed to that, setting personal goals, reaching them, failing them, working through why you failed, planning a business activity. And this is what CBT does. It's about thinking about what problems you have, why they're problematic. That's the cognitive element. And then the behavioral element is practicing, I'm going to take baby steps. I'm going to practice these things, often fail, work through that failure, and try to get better. Right? So it's a little bit by learning by doing. The second thing they were targeting within the skills of self-control were the automatic emotional reactions to perceived slights, to stimuli, and they would practice non-aggressive responses to control their anger, control their emotions, and to learn to react differently in situations. Start by role-playing, that's the baby step. Start by working through some issue at home, and get more and more ambitious and taking bigger and bigger steps over those 8 weeks. The second thing that was perhaps less conventional, so that what I've just described is a classic application of cognitive behavioral therapy to tackle issues of self-control, issues of aggression. There's lots of sort of small sample evidence for years and years and years, if not decades, that this works in the general population to some degree and can even work among juvenile delinquents, though never tested at scale. What was a little bit unusual about the STYLE program is that it was also helping people practice becoming a new person, to stop thinking of yourself as an outcast and to start thinking of yourself as a normal member of society. Right? They all knew what the values of the outcast group was, and they all knew what the values of a normal mainstream society member were. And if they felt that they belonged to that mainstream group, then they could begin to internalize some of those norms and values and behave differently. And so the whole idea of the program was also help them practice being a normal person, right? To learn how to dress well, to learn how to sort of clean your body, to learn how to go into a supermarket, to learn how to go into a bank, to sort of let them in the secret that we're all sort of pretending all of the time, that we're basically all making it up and just trying to convince everybody else we're a normal person and that they can learn too. Their successes were positively reinforced, and their failures and setbacks they processed, and they went back to it again and again. They were doing this by meeting 3 times a week in the morning. They were doing this by having homework and practicing in their daily lives when they're outside of the classroom. And on off days when they weren't meeting together, the counselors like Johnson were meeting with them and coaching them through problems, often finding them at their home or their workplace. So we decided to take this style program, the cognitive behavioral therapy element, the CBT, and evaluate it randomly relative to a control condition where young men got nothing. We also decided to contrast it to something that cost about the same amount to deliver as the CBT, which is a CBT, this style program cost about $200 per person. So we said, well, what if we just benchmark this to a cash transfer? But in particular, we think that this cash transfer could also help men leave lives of crime by giving them the money they need to start up some alternative enterprise. Because a lot of these young men spoke about wanting to shine shoes, start a small petty business, basically setting up a little stall or a wheelbarrow in the market full of used goods that they could sell. And we would also test that against the condition where they received both. The CBT of 8 weeks followed by the cash grant of $200, all right, where that $200 might be able to help them implement some of the lessons they've just practiced in CBT, making a plan, implementing a plan, and adopting a business and an identity as a small entrepreneur that's going to be different from their old street persona. And so we worked with NEPA to recruit roughly 1,000 of the highest risk men that we could identify in the city. So we went to, and NEPA had been working with these populations for years and knew where they could be located, went in the 5 highest risk neighborhoods, which are huge neighborhoods, recruited sort of the 1% of the highest risk men into this program. About 2/3 of those that we approached were interested in being eligible for this program. And that's the sample of 999. And then we randomized treatment in public draws with full information to all of these men. Now, what do we find after 1 year? Well, we went back after 1 year. So this was sort of 2009, 2010. We went back a year later, and we found that it's a slight exaggeration to sort of say there is no change in the cognitive behavioral therapy condition. There was a slight improvement, but it was not in their antisocial behaviors, in their everyday fights, their participation in thefts, robberies, drug selling, drug using, etc. There wasn't no change, but there was a modest and not statistically significant change within a year. With the $200 grant, within the course of a year, within the first month, a lot of these young men, all of them started businesses, their incomes rose, and in the short run, within the first month, their criminal activities seemed to go down. But a year later, that money was gone. It was stolen, maybe the businesses failed, maybe police seized their goods, just 100 adverse things happened. And so a year later, there was really no change in the antisocial behaviors of those who received the $200 grant. But there was this amazing, sign that within a year, that getting both of these things, the men who received both of them, roughly, they were about half as likely to be engaged in thefts, petty crimes, street violence, other aggressive behaviors in comparison to men in the control group. Here we can see, we went back after a further 9 years to have 10 years of data, and we found 93% of survivors. Tragically, about 11% of the men had died. These death rates were relatively similar across the 4 groups. But through a Herculean effort by IPA Liberia, they managed to find 93% of the survivors. And here's what we see. Summarizing what I just sort of told you for the first year, it's important to note, if you look at the control condition, their antisocial behaviors diminished dramatically over the first year. Why is that happening? That's happening because we're catching men at their worst moment, at their most antisocial. Why? Because we're actively selecting the men who are antisocial. And so, of course, just a simple mean reversion accompanied by the fact that these men are getting a little bit older and so potentially more stable with age, we see this sort of decline. This is why it's so important to have a randomized control trial to compare to, because if we merely looked at before and after in a treatment group, of course, we'd see a decline because of this natural reversion to the mean. We don't really see any significant difference between the cash arm and the control group over the course of the 10 years. But with both therapy and therapy plus cash, we see these declines relative to the control group much steeper with the therapy group versus the control, and the therapy only being somewhere in the middle. All right. And so this is basically that 50% reduction. Basically, half of the men, basically of the men still engaged in antisocial behaviors in the control group, which has reduced itself, about half of the men that would have otherwise been involved in those antisocial behaviors have basically found another life. That's why we see the 50% reduction. It's not that everybody's still committing crimes, but they're just doing, they're stealing 50% less. It's actually about half the men leaving the life and half the men not. And what's amazing is just how sustained this is over time in both the therapy and cash and the control group. So we continue to see almost identical treatment effects after 10 years. And one of the more interesting things is that therapy alone starts to look a little bit larger and more robust. And indeed, these are statistically significant differences by the 10-year mark. And so even the CBT alone seems to have been really impactful in really helping a lot of these men, not all of them, but maybe 30, 40, 50% of them leave this life and transition to something more normal. Okay, so what exactly was going on? Well, and why does the combination of both help both in the short run and to some extent in the long run? Well, what you can think of is, look, like this is what your outside option looks like, right? If you're especially rich and you have lots of capital, you can start a business and this is in the red light district, and basically run a business, but that's not an option. At best, you might be able to sort of aspire to own a taxi, or at least rent a taxi and make some money. But realistically, in the short run, your option is to sort of be a petty trader. You buy a bunch of used goods and you sell them in the market. If you have no capital whatsoever, you're this poor guy who's literally able to afford 4 bottles of shampoo or face cream and have a few more in his backpack and walk around carrying them in his arms trying to hawk them, okay? And so what we think the cash is doing is the cash is basically helping reinforce some of these lessons of CBT, because you end your program after 8 weeks, and then you've got to make a living, right? And if you're received therapy alone, well, there's lots of lessons you'd like to implement in your life, but the fact is you have to eat tomorrow. And the only way you know how to make money, or one of the only main ways you know how to make money, is to go back to drug selling or crime. And so that's the opposite of an opportunity to practice those behaviors. Receiving the cash, on the other hand, gave you this opportunity for 4 to 6 months of extra practice, putting those lessons into play, right? The cash was gone after a year, tragically, right? Moving ahead, we'd love to learn how to make the economic assistance stick. But because the cash alone didn't raise your incomes within a year, that's not what's driving this added effect. The fact that you have a business, it's probably, we don't know for sure, it's probably this added reinforcement. And so this is, anyways, this is just our treatment effects in the, sorry, this is the cash only, therapy only, and the both group, sorry, without adequate labels, showing the non-significance of the 1 year of therapy only, moving to be significant after 10 years, and the sustained treatment effect and significance of both. Okay, this was powerful. And when the evidence emerged 7, 8 years ago, and we conducted all of these analyses, it coincided with the results of a very similar style CBT program held in Chicago high schools called Becoming a Man, where young men, therapy alone seemed to help young men leave this life, avoid this life, and reduce their probability of arrest and increase their probability of high school graduation within the first year, with those effects of therapy alone petering out after a year. So strikingly close to what we'd seen in Liberia in an entirely different context. Okay. And then in 2016, following the results of both these programs, Chicago experienced a homicide spike, a spike that has continued to rise to the point that today we're experiencing levels of violence in these cities, murders on the order of 30, 40 per 100,000 per year, that are equivalent to some of the most violent periods in the city's history, like the 1980s and the 1990s. And these two pieces of evidence, from Becoming a Man, and from Style in Liberia, helped inspire a new approach to violence reduction in Chicago, one that would draw on CBT, would add this economic assistance program, but most importantly, unlike the BAM program, would tackle the highest risk men in the city, much like we did in Liberia. But the highest risk men in Chicago, I can assure you, are an order of magnitude more risky and more, and in some sense, their violence is more lethal than anything we see in Liberia, partly because they're slightly more organized in Chicago, and most importantly, because of the widespread availability of guns, so that the same street violence, the same fights turn violent. So here's this homicide spike in 2016 that's just continued to go tragically up in the last 4 years. And this model, which became known as Ready Chicago, is a partnership led by the NGO Heartland Alliance, involves dozens of transitional jobs providers. This is and dozens of therapeutic organizations and dozens of street outreach organizations that are helping to identify these young men and recruit them into this program. And so this was a much longer and more intense program, designed so partly because of the higher risk level and the higher lethality and of the young men we were trying to target in Liberia. And so instead of there being 8 weeks of cognitive behavioral therapy and a $200 cash grant, it's an 18-month-long intervention should you choose to join. 30 hours a week, you're working in what's known as a transitional job, which means in the early months, you might be picking up trash or cleaning up playgrounds. And the idea is that by the end of the 18 months, you're working in a factory or possibly even in an office. That's the transitional component. You're doing that for 30 hours a week. And then in sessions, you're doing 10 hours a week of group-based, mostly cognitive behavioral therapy, not unlike what we just saw in groups, in circles, just in slightly nicer surroundings and buildings than were available in Liberia. We, through a variety of means, both through these street outreach organizations and through a predictive algorithm using machine learning off of hospital and police data, we were able to identify incredibly high-risk men, the men in our control group over the 20 months after randomization. 11 out of 100 were shot or killed or arrested for shooting and killing another. So this is a ridiculously high rate of violence and risk, and just goes to show how important it is to be delivering programs like this in cities like Chicago and potentially elsewhere. What do we see 20 months later in the full group? Well, I will be very honest, the results are promising, but a little more mixed than what we see in Liberia. So first of all, we identified 3 major outcomes. So the main outcome that we were interested in originally was basically whether or not we think you shot or killed another person. So by which we have an imperfect proxy for that, which is whether or not you were arrested. Most people are not arrested. Maybe 5 or 10% of homicides in Chicago clear in the sense that they result in a shooting or homicide arrest. So it's an imperfect proxy, and it's rare. All right, now we see a 64% improvement, meaning the men who go through Ready are 64% less likely to shoot and arrest. Once we correct for 3 different outcomes, this is not quite statistically significant. This is a 95% confidence interval. Before we make that correction, it's actually statistically significant at the 90% level, but we have to be very cautious with such results. Knowing that this was rare and going to be hard to measure, we decided actually to specify our primary measure as a combination of 3 things, not just whether or not we have some indication that you shot or killed another, but whether you yourself was shot, which again goes down 18%, but not statistically significant. So dramatic change, not robust. And then we also thought that the more common other forms of serious violence would move in the same direction, and we don't see that at all. There's really no statistically or substantively significant change in any direction. Okay, so what's going on? Well, let's just explore a few other patterns in this data. One is that if we average these things, or if we consider them individually, we're essentially weighting all of these things equally. What we can also do is, and what we pre-specified, is that we would actually create a weighted average of these 3 things relative to their social cost to society. Now, those are not made up numbers. You can put some numbers to the cost to the individual, to the cost of the criminal justice system, to the cost of the city, and you can have low and high end estimates. And both our most conservative and our more inclusive estimates suggest large and highly statistically significant benefits to society and to the individual naturally relative to the cost, ranging from 4 to 1 to almost 19 to 1. primarily because of this reduction in shooting and homicide arrests. What's more is we mainly recruited men into the program two ways. One, by these outreach referrals, whereby they knew the men in advance, they had screened them, they were selected to be interested and engaged, and they had a trusting relationship with the outreach organizations, and that's about half of the people in the program. The other half are ones that come from our machine learning algorithm. By definition, we're trying to find people who are off the radar of the outreach organizations. They were harder to find. When we found them, they were less trusting, they were less engaged, they were less likely to take up the program. Okay, and so we said we're going to not only look at the overall effects, we're going to look at these two major subgroups. And what we find is much larger and more statistically significant reductions in being shot or shooting others when we recruited through these more trusting, established relationships with men who are ready. Now, what factors of these, what of this recruitment mechanism actually drove higher rates of success? It's difficult for us to say. We've done a lot of qualitative interviews, and we do think this element of trust, longstanding engagement, active amounts and the sort of mental readiness to change their lives was extremely important. What's the implication? Well, there's a couple of implications, I think, that we learned from this trio of studies. There's BAM, which you can see here. There's STYLE, and there's READY that I've just talked to, right? Very different groups. We have a bunch of at-risk adolescents in Chicago high schools, so not especially high risk, not always actively engaged or moderately engaged. We see a group of young men who are living on the streets, living much more criminal and violent lives, but then nothing compared to the levels of crime, violence, trauma, victimization, and lethality of their own violence of the men in READY, okay? And we're seeing pretty consistent results across these three groups, which is remarkable. I think one thing we learn is that, look, we make all of these investments in early childhood and in young childhood, which are obviously important. A lot of these cognitive behavioral skills of self-control, of identity, of emotional regulation are ones that we teach in preschools, throughout elementary school, and so forth. And we teach them because we think they work. They make boys and girls and young men and women successful across all strata of society. But there are a very small number of people, typically young men in most cities, maybe only a few thousand, who continue to commit the most serious forms of violence. And they need something remedial, right? And so far, our societal response in most countries has been to jail them, to kill them, to deter them through threats and punishment and coercion. Right, and policing to some degree is effective, right? Building systems of predictable rules and enforcement, and especially building fair systems of justice. There's an enormous amount of evidence that works preventatively and responsively, but it's not enough, right? Far better to prevent these incredible social harms, and far better if we can not use coercion and not use incarceration and do something that's more preventative. And what these studies suggest is that approach can work, and it can work in very different environments. And so I think the next step is for other cities to ask themselves, is this something that can work in my city? Can we try it? How do we build the technical capacity to do that? And that's something that I and Ready Chicago and NEPA Liberia and the IPA Peace and Recovery Program are prepared to try to help with, that technical advising and that diagnosis and that identifying of, is this going to work? And I would say what all these situations have in common are relatively disorganized groups committing a lot of violence that I would call either reactionary or hot-headed, or a lot of pursuit of perhaps short-sighted blood feuds, right? None of these are systems of highly organized criminal violence, right? I spend a lot of time working in Medellin, where you have a degree of violence between groups, but these are highly hierarchical and organized armed groups. And when there's violence, it's because groups strategically have chosen that violence is their best option. Not always, but that's a good description. And CBT is not going to fix Medellin. There's a small number of young men who could benefit. There's lots of ways in which it might help, but it's not going to drive the violence down in that city, right? I think if you are in a context, if you are in a city with lots of relatively small, somewhat organized groups and a lot of retaliatory violence and settling of personal grudges, then I think this approach has a lot of promise. There needs to be more testing and adaptation to other contexts, but I think across these 3 studies and across the sort of humongous number of other smaller scale studies, there's some real evidence that this is powerful and can work. So I'm just going to leave it at that and hand it over to our.
Thank you, Helke, and thank you, Chris. First of all, I want to thank for the invitation. It's an honor to be part of this panel. Thank you to the institutions that host the seminar. I will do some brief comments on the policy implications of Chris Blattman's study and of CBT interventions in general. And mostly I will underscore some of the things that Christopher Blattman has already said, but that I think are important. Just to give you some background, in Mexico City, our government, led by the Ministry of Citizen Security, has implemented a CBT-informed program that is called Reconnecting with Peace, Reconecta con la Paz in Español. And this program identifies young adults at risk through by taking them from the criminal justice system through a pre-trial diversion scheme, where mostly all of these young men and women have committed petty crimes or were caught committing petty crimes, because later on we learned that it's not the only conducts or that they have engaged in. And we have so far worked with over 800 young men. We started the program in September 2021. It has not been evaluated or doesn't have an impact evaluation as the one that Christopher described, but we pretty much follow a lot of the guidelines that previous experience and previous evidence has shown to be effective when deploying CBT-informed policies. I will be referring to these program in comparison to READY and, of course, the intervention in Liberia, to make some points of what are the implications of adapting or translating some of these findings into other contexts. And the first, I want to share 5 key policy points or key implications. The first one, the first implication of a study like the one that has been presented is a very simple one, but very important for those of us that are in the policymaking field. And it is that an evaluation like this and work like this gives us hope. Because many times we start doing a lot of work that is not going anywhere, or at least that we don't know whether it is going anywhere. It many times is the product of intuition or of political biased decisions of what people think that could work, but there is no evidence around it. And when you find that there are policies like the ones described by Chris that could work, that have evidence behind them, it is easier to put them in practice and feel comfortable with them and start running towards a result. I think it is very important, just for those of you that are running these type of programs in different contexts, to know that there is an evidence support to what you're doing, and that's very, very important. And the natural implication of that is that as policymakers, we need to evaluate what we are doing to see whether what we are doing works and what we're doing is not harming people, because that's another outcome of many interventions that we put in place. And be brave enough to stop doing things that are not either working or that are harming people. So this is like a good beginning to have this very solid evidence behind things that as policymakers we implement. The second one is that CBT informed treatment or interventions, as the ones described, are ideal for what criminologist David Garland called high crime societies. These societies could be characterized as societies where there is a lot of crime taking place, and institutions that provide services, just health, social care, and other general services, and as well justice criminal justice institutions are either weak or people don't have access to them, sometimes corruption mediating between them. And these type of interventions allow you, because of their characteristics, to do something good, something that has impact in this context that that we can frame or conceptualize as high crime societies. And I'm not talking only about places like Liberia or Mexico or some parts of Mexico. I'm also talking about some neighborhoods or some communities in the United States and other parts of what is usually called the developed world, where crime is somehow over the top of what institutions or regular institutions can handle, including criminal justice institutions. And why is that? And Chris just mentioned a couple of those elements. One of them is the cost effectiveness of these interventions. Literally, and talking from experience, literally you don't need nothing but good organizations, some facilities, some training, and people willing to do the work. And that is something, at least in the Latin American context or the Mexican context, sometimes we tend to think that policies that have a lot of investment behind them are better than the ones that don't. And that is completely that is not true at all. And I think the key element here, as I said before, is to consider whether there is good evidence behind what we're doing or not. And I want to stress or underscore the human resource issue. It is very difficult in places like Latin America, or in many places like Latin America, I don't want ever to generalize my comments, but to find a good pool of super highly qualified and trained specialists to deploy policy. So finding something or doing something, as the interventions describe, where you can pretty much train somebody that has a certain profile, rapport abilities to do something like that, allows you to create or implement programs very easily. Of course, it is desirable to have a highly trained and specialist at every part of every intervention, but that is rarely the case in many of the places where these type of policies could be implemented. And this doesn't mean that you don't find ways of putting together teams that can balance those. I won't call them deficiencies, but those opportunities in your implementation. You can always have like a team of social workers, a team of experienced territory people, but you can also include teams that can provide psychological support to those implementing or facilitating the workshops, which is something that is very important. They are constantly exposed to very tragic situations and to very tragic stories. Or you can also play with the profiles of the people supervising those that are facilitating the workshops to account for that. The other thing that these type of interventions allow is to work with a high volume of people. Sometimes, and we've come across a lot of people criticizing these type of interventions, saying, well, you are not going for every aspect of that person's life, or you are not treating everything that is wrong in their lives. But the reality is that in these high crime societies, you need to deal with a high volume of people. As I said, it's not harmful, it's not age or gender specific. So those are characters that make these type of policies very good for the context that we're working on. And as mentioned, the evidence shows that these policies have impact, and they do reduce crime and help reducing crime, help reducing violence. So we're not guessing whether we're doing something that does that. Of course, there are several issues that we need to bear in mind when designing our interventions. Chris mentioned some of them. The recruitment issue. How do I identify people that could benefit the most from this? People at very high risk and everything that implies. The attrition or dropping out problem. Some way of dealing with that is through cash transfers. In reconnecting with peace, we do that by mandatory attendance ordered by judges in the pretrial diversion scheme. The continuity or follow-up problem. I think everybody that has implemented something like this sooner or later realizes that there needs to be something else after the CBT therapy or the CBT intervention, as Reddy is doing now in Chicago. So finding ways of either training for employment or finding jobs or other subsidized cash transfers for these people is very important. And of course, the context problem. All of these you can do in places where the economy can absorb unemployed people, but sometimes, and in many places in Latin America or other parts of the world, you will come across a problem that the actual economy in the city or the country is not enough to absorb everybody with their skills or the type of skills they have into the economy. So you need to plan for that. It is also important, and I know I'm running out of time, but I want to make these quick points. It's also very important to be aware of the politics behind, or the political economy behind, or informing or facing these implementations. We will always find when doing this from the liberals or the left wing or left wing thinking in Latin America, or in Latin American terms, that these type of interventions are not long-term effective, that they don't deal with the root causes of crime, or that they are not enough to change inequalities or structural elements. I completely agree with that. And we're not dealing on how we ended up doing this in high crime societies, but there is a need to do something, and something that works to start reducing crime and violence. At the same time, these interventions are perfectly compatible with other major efforts to change institutions and to change the provision of services in many places. So there is not an either or debate or dilemma here. It's about doing something that works at the same time that other major processes take place. And from the right wing or conservatives, we will always find criticisms in saying that why are we spending time working with people that lost their chance, that are criminals, that need to be put in jail. Well, and this is a very important point, mainly now in Latin America, where there are some policies that are gaining traction and some success stories that are being built up or told about incarceration and punitive policies being the solution to crime. And that's also a false dilemma. We can never forget that the way we do things matter, and that in many of those punitive, massively punitive policies can have further effects in society and in the lives of people. And moreover, imagine you have a country that just decided to put in standby every constitutional guarantee. Stop doing that. What is it that is left instead of that period of non-constitutional rights being enforced? You have nothing. Basically, you didn't work on the institutions. You didn't work in policies that can actually reduce crime without hurting. So there is a very interesting debate there on why is it important to do things that are committed to human rights, or the promotion of human rights, and at the same time that are effective. A very, very large debate, especially now in our region, where, as I said, there will be soon enough success stories built around punitiveness. And finally, and this is very important for policymakers,
we can wrap up.
Yeah, CBT interventions are a very good product in terms of communication. And that is something that that we need to have in mind, because it's always very important to be able to communicate results, to be able to know and learn about personal stories of people that have managed to change their life in order to advance policies and gain political traction and gain support to do what we're doing. Thank you very much.